Gianluca, I'll set you up as co-host, just in case I miss someone in the waiting room, you can let them in.
Perfect.
Okay, well, hello everyone. We are super excited and honored to welcome our distinguished and much loved guest, poet and novelist Mona Arshi. A big thanks to you all for joining us today, or it could be tonight, depending on where you're joining us from. And we're delighted as ever to have you join this wonderful session today. We'd like to take a moment to thank our festival sponsors for this year, the American University in Dubai, Università Gabriele D'Annunzio in Italy, EBSCO Host Information Services, Montessori Academy Australia, Pedagogy and Beyond UAE, Salmon Poetry Ireland, and the International Association for Jungian Studies. For those of you who don't know me, I am Roula-Maria. I'm the editor of Indelible, and my lovely co-host today is Dr. Gianluca Sardi, who is joining us from Italy today. Before we introduce Mona properly, I'd like to take a moment to remind everybody to keep their microphones muted in order to avoid any interfering background noise. And we will be having 2 mini Q&A sessions throughout the session. So please leave your comments and questions in the chat box if you want to get them there ready before the Q&A starts. Alternatively, you could also choose to raise your hand, whether through the raise hand icon or actually raise your hand during the Q&A session so that we can invite you to use the microphone. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to you, Gianluca.
Thank you very much, Rula, for inviting me today. It's a real honor for me to be here with you and Mona and to attend this wonderful session of this exciting festival of literature. Mona Arshi will talk about what a poem can hold and the reasons she's traveled between prose and poetry. She will read both from her 2 books of poetry and her recently published novel, Somebody Loves You. Mona Arshi worked as a human rights lawyer at Liberty before she started writing poetry. She worked on a number of high-profile legal cases, including the Stephen Lawrence case, representing Janet Alder and Diane Pretty. She also represented women fleeing violence in homes, as well as refugees whilst in private practice. She completed her master's in poetry in 2011 at the University of East Anglia with a distinction. Her DB collection, Small Hands, won the Forward Prize for Best First Collection in 2015. She has also been a prize winner in the Magma, Troubadour, and Manchester Creative Writing competitions. Mona has curated poetry events at the House of Commons with EBAW and Violence Against Women on International Women's Day, and co-edited a special issue of Poem magazine on the theme of Brexit in June 2017. Mona makes regular appearances on the radio, including Front Row, and was commissioned to write a program on the Odyssey for Book of the Week for Radio 4, which was broadcast in March 2017. Her poems and interviews have been published in many magazines, but also in The Times, The Guardian, Granta, and The Times of India, as well as on the London Underground. Mona has collaborated with dancers, Dancing Words, musicians, Vidal Montgomery, and fashion, Jigsaw, and Gallery Unconfined. She has read at various festivals, as well as the BFI, South Bank, British Museum, Mansion House, and galleries throughout the United Kingdom. Mona works as a tutor for the Arvon Foundation and the Poetry School. Mona has judged the National Poetry Competition, the Forward Prize, and is on the judging panel for the T.S. Eliot Awards in 2020. Mona, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, both of you, for inviting me to read today in this wonderful festival that I've been following. I guess we have quite a long session, which is quite nice. It means that I can sort of stretch my legs a little bit and sort of read more expansively than I'm used to doing, which is kind of wonderful in some ways. So I guess I'll just start by saying welcome to everyone, and I'm going to sort of flip between prose and poetry today and talk a little bit about my poetics, and also I talk about this relationship between the books of poetry that I've written, which is Small Hands and Dear Big Gods, and then the book of prose that I've just recently published, which is Somebody Loves You, and because they're kind of really kind of connected together, I guess. So I'm going to start by just reading you one of the first poems in the book of the first collection, Small Hands. And it's an important poem, and it's a sort of poem, I suppose, about language, really. And, you know, I went from being a lawyer when I was dealing with kind of, you know, being in this kind of room where language is very limited and the imagination was very, very narrow. And I went from that to, I think, working in a house of poetry, which was the opposite of that, really. It was, I think, you can never feel as free as when you're inside a poem. And there was a wonderful, I suppose, luxuriating in that for a time when I realized that I could just have this, I could have whatever language I wanted as a poet. And I suppose this poem, I suppose, is a sort of celebration of that. It's also a sort of linguistic and sort of sexual tussle in a relationship as well. So the poem is The Lion. How unstable and old he is now. Lion like God has snacks sent up by means of a pulley. Although you can never master the deep language of lion, I am made dumb by the rough stroke of his tongue upon mine. Nowadays I make allowances. We lie together and I hear the crackle of his bones. And when I bring myself to open my eyes, he weeps, his pupils resembling dark embroidered felt circles. Sometimes I think all I am is a comfort blanket for his arthritic mouth, but many evenings he'll sit twisted behind the drapery, solving my vulgar fractions with nothing but his claws. Lion and I break bread. I tend to his mane, and he sets 1,000 scented fuses under my skin. He starts undressing me under the sweetening stars. Please, girls, please, girl, he mused, this might be the last time I will see how the thin light enters you. So that was the first poem. I mean, I suppose the other thing I should say about Small Hands is that I started writing this, I think, almost sort of 10 years ago, probably 11 years ago, really, when I started writing poetry. And I started writing the book when I was actually studying for a master's at the University of East Anglia. And then, and I was sort of learning to become a poet. You know, I was learning about language of poetry. I was learning about syntax. I was learning about lineation and learning about form as well. And I was reading a lot too. And there was a kind of awful event that happened in my family. My brother died very, very suddenly, my youngest brother. And then I felt like at a very, very unfairly early time of my writing as becoming a poet, I had to ask myself how I was going to write about this terrible event and whether or not poems could hold that event. And I suppose what that gave me was an opportunity in some ways to think kind of, and in a way, think about what a poem can hold, what is possible to hold in a poem. And I suppose that kind of touches on this idea of silence and what a poem is able to hold that nothing else can hold, that a piece of journalism can't hold, that a piece of prose can't hold. What can a poem hold? And I was kind of asking myself that question. And I came across this wonderful quote by Eliot about how a poem is nothing less than a raid on the inarticulate. It's quite a famous quote, but I think it's sort of so wonderful because I think that really, it describes something that I've always felt that poetry has been able to do in my reading, and that is that it can hold the ineffable. It can hold things that no other form can hold. And I think that's why I'm probably in poetry, and that's why I write poems. So I sort of feel like I want to tell you that Small Hands was born really out of this sort of silent scream. You know, it was how do I transfer this, what happened in this terrible event, this experience, and how do I turn that into something, and how is it held in a poetic line? And so I'll read some of those poems for you today. I'll start with a poem about my mother, and it's called The Bird. And it's about looking at my mother, and it came out of a dream, actually. It's a series of sort of little poems that kind of form the kind of quiet center of the book. And yeah, it's called The Bird. She's a prize forager. An assortment of beetle wings are arranged like shiny badges under her bed. Her mealworms have been freeze-dried with such care that they twitch in the bowl when resurrected with just a speck of water. She smells of preening oil, salt, top notes of earth. My mother is turning bird, this tiny, impossible thing, perched in my hand, molecules exciting her eyes. Then the soft click, click that unlocks her humanity. She separates from the tips of my fingers, hops to the gap in the window, leaving complex glitter in my palm. And I'm going to also read a poem called April. April. Brave things are happening in the garden when I'm not looking. The junction of each branch holds its sobriety. Frost no longer attempts to fasten onto the deepest roots, but still I'm not sure about trusting myself with the distances. In the house, they come to terms. The youngest has gone. The rooms vibrate. My father weighs his son's glasses in his hands. The word they use for zero is shunya. They come to terms with its blank center. And then this is a poem called Notes Towards an Elegy. And actually this poem, I think, overtly acknowledges the ineffable nature of the experiences you're trying to translate into the language of poems. And so I think that reference to notes, Notes Towards an Elegy is this acknowledgement that you're always striving to do this. So I'll read it. It's in 7 parts. 1. Entirely occupied. A million throats migrate towards my ribs, secrete syllables in my chest. All pores and openings have acquiesced. I'm slurring in my sleep. 2. The accumulation of departures, the mornings of staring down light. Blame the bend in the trees, blame the abstract, blame my stupid, dumb hands. 3. I've forgotten what silence feels like. Tongue loosened with no protest, the other tongue, a ceramic figurine, presses against my teeth. 4. What I know is that I'm straining to name the parts, have failed to name the parts of the poem. 5. The back of my hand inscribed with dates are like the hands of a small bone boy sitting under the twitching shade of a tree. 6. We found the stumbling bird together and hand-fed her with white bread soaked in milk. We had to leave her by the green shed and she did die. You noted the delicate integrity of its fretwork. 7. Wait, fast, ghost. You should see how the living room is choked with living things and your mother is upstairs, sitting on your bed, nurturing scraps in the poor light. And I'll read one more poem, which is called Phone Call on a Train Journey. And again, I suppose this poem is, it's amazing what happens when you hear some news of a terrible event and it enters through your ear, and what that kind of cognitive violence, I guess, is what this poem is about, and how often when that happens, you kind of veer to the mundane almost, as if the mind wants to reject what it's hearing through the ear. So I suppose this is what the poem is really trying to say. Phone Call on a Train Journey. The smallest human bone in the ear weighs no more than a grain of rice. She keeps thinking it means something, but probably is nothing. Something's lost. She craves it, hunting in pockets, sleeves, checks the eyelets in fabric. Could you confirm you were his sister? When they pass her his rimless glasses, they're packed into a padded sleeve. Several signatures later, his rucksack in her hands, without the perishables, lighter than she had imagined. So I think what I'll do is actually read a poem from Dear Big Gods, which talks directly to that poem. And I'll find that poem for you here. It's called 5-Year Update, and what my lovely publishers did, because all the lines are very long, they turn the poem the other way around. So as you can see how long those lines are, really long lines. This is a poem called 5-Year Update, and it's a poem called, I call it a tornado poem. And actually, the reason I call it a tornado poem is that once or twice in your life as a poet, but poems come to you fully formed. And you know, this is one of those poems. It was about 5 years after my brother's death. I was out running. I had like a line in my head that came to me. I came home, I took out the printer paper. The printer paper was sort of, you know, just in the hallway. I grabbed the printer paper and I turned the printer paper that way around. So it was like that. I ended up writing these really long lines, and the poem came out really quickly, like a tornado. And it was basically raining lines. And actually, even after I'd edited it, it's very similar to the printer paper poem that I initially wrote in pencil. When I compare the poems, they're still really similar. And I wanted to, I was so attached to those long lines. So I'll read you the poem. I need a bit of water before I read it, because the long lines give you no breath. It's quite, well, you'll see there's a relationship with trains. And so is this kind of propulsion of the poem. 5-Year Update. And I just want to say, this is kind of me talking to my brother who's dead. 5-Year Update. I hope it's fine to contact you to tell you that I still watch the gaps in the carriages and listen out for the service has been disrupted announcement for some other poor sister's new news. 5 years ago, the American women overheard my call just before Colchester. They passed bottles of water and granola bars to my seat. 3 women in their 60s, each with the same face powder. It's always the daughters, they say. It's always the same graffiti over the bridge. When you pass in the rain decades later, those most insects are content to fly through raindrops, so I've heard. As for the humming living, well, we are still standing in the polluted shade, whilst under us the choked up sap retreats back into the soil, and there's us, maggot blind, walking into rooms backwards pacing, all diligently pursuing our jumpy little grieflings, stalking those roly-poly sour bugs living, breeding under the patio table. Yes, acceptance was something I believed in, but all of a sudden you are lying down and you are no longer tall, but long, not to mention your arm that mechanically pokes out of my dream, like it's fishing. No one profits from pitchy memory apart from Nepenthe's twisted therapist, since you've gone to ashes now, and we've turned the box into the water of the Thames near the dogwood, crying. Standing under a low roof, dirtying the window with our dirty hands, we've turned your trainers south-facing into the indigo night, rest assured, my bony-breathed brother. Voices, voices, hence this update. Remember we counted yellow cars in our Fiat 128. Well, what's your perfect fuel now, oh supersonic boy? Your judge-dread, crime-plagued future's gone to waste. I can't help but curse, and what better use for breath, you might say. I don't know about you, but I've left part of myself in Inwood Park, cozying up to a gold dog in the sunshine, but only afterward rode, and you'd practice your catters on the so-green grass by the benches. Which part of you was left there? The Egyptians, they have a name for it. I've been wearing my extravagant robes with the hems ruptured, the cord tied oh so loosely. How many breaths in later, I've got older but smaller. I've gone down one lump, not two. I still don't swim, and yes, I still can't take a photograph. I see your face from time to time, especially on trains, where it flashes up in the gangway. Just before we slow right down, I reach for the door handle, alight, and run to the barriers. So, I mean, that poem, I think, is a really important poem. I think that there's so much of like my brother's childhood in that poem, and I felt like there was something about capturing that actually, and kind of giving his life dignity, and the relationship I had with him, dignity in that poem that came out, like I said, in a big, huge tornado. So I'm going to read a little bit from Dear Big Gods, and I'll tell you a little bit about Dear Big Gods because I feel like these two books are siblings. I feel that this Dear Big Gods was written quite quickly after Small Hands, and actually, you know, I wanted to write a very different book for Dear Big Gods. I wanted to write about, I had a different title for the book, and I realized that your poems are wiser than you are, and your poems dictate what needs to be written. And actually, at the end of the day, I was not done with grief, and there is no expiry date on it. And there are certain things that being away from time gives you, away from a terrible event, that have to be dealt with head on by a poet. And so I had to sort of accept that this book was going to have a relationship to the first book, and I do sort of see them as siblings. But I also think that this book in some ways is also it's really interested in things like poetry's deep participation in the ritual of making things. And I think that there are lots of it's very creaturely books. There are lots of little kind of creatures are in the soil of the book without me even really noticing them. It's just the book was finished, and then when I just realized. And I don't know what they're doing there, but I feel like a lot of these things that are in the book, the creatures, are the kind of fugitive guests in the book. So I'll read some of the poems from Dear Big Gods. I'm going to start with the first poem, which is a tiny little poem called Little Prayer, and I was just again interested in the kind of ancient logic of prayer that we've always used, and the relationship between prayer and poetry, which have always really been quite close cousins, you know. And there's something about being able to utter a prayer into the air, which changes the air, which I feel that often about poems as well. So this is Little Prayer. Little Prayer. It's me again. This time I'm a wren. Last time I was the first white sap. Don't blow away the fruit flies, but visit my pockets of blue-black pain. Little prayer, I am still here, hunkered down with the worm casts, blind song, shrinking in my scratchy after feathers. And then another really creaturely poem which is in this book, is called Something. Something scrambled out of me. At least I thought it was out of me. It could have been into me. Very fast, very sly, dirty-breathed assassin. Spiders, ants, earthworms I witnessed being dissected by my brothers, and crane flies I tried but never managed to capture whole. Such fey, stupid wings and legs left drifting on walls. Mostly I was a witness. Mostly I've kept out of my way with my hood zipped up to my chin. What is the surest thing we know? As we grow older, we think of less of killing things and more of coming back. Who knows where we acquire this knowledge? From our mothers, aunts, perhaps. They pass it on like a candle through an ancient pockmarked door. Something parenthetic, like a clasp, broken, useless as a rotten wick. A spider climbing the sublime coast of your shoulders and walking through those rooms again. A web breaking on the back of your hand. And I think I'll just read like maybe 2 more poems from Dear Big Gods. I'd like to read the ghazal actually, if that's okay. I love ghazals and I'm just kind of slightly obsessed with them, to be honest with you. And I think that they are so different to Western forms. I think they are the most unrepressed form of poetry. They're so misunderstood, as we know. And I feel like you can put things in a ghazal that perhaps we are so resistant to do in Western poetry. So you can put the abstract in, you can put the heart in, you can put infinite desire in, you know, the extremes of emotion into ghazals. It seems to just be able to contain obsession and all those extreme things. So I'm going to read one for you, and it's just called Ghazal. It has a little epigraph, which is a little Arab saying, I thought you my bird and built you a nest in my heart. Breathe me in this disheveled night. I go unnoticed. The airs turn strange and solid, but only I will notice. If I allow beams of light to pass through the pinholes of my torso, and if light strikes the wall on the other side, would you notice? Tonight, you're 3 parts God and 1 part sandalwood dust. I keep catching your scent by the window. I always notice. My words pile up like prophets on the point of my tongue. What passes for transparency are those things you don't notice. I steal robin's eggs and sketch powder down feathers for you. My pocket heats a pulsing nest the creatures never even notice. If you could let me bangle my arms around you, rain would fall. It would speck my lips, my open fingers. Then you'd notice. Instead, my eye remains locked in the platinum part of the flower. The highest branches are the only living things to notice. So I think I'll stop there because I think we're almost at 4:30, and you might have some questions.
Mona, thank you so much for reminding me why you are one of my absolute favorite poets. This was wonderful. Thank you so much for that. I mean, it always strikes a chord, and hearing you read them, I mean, it's just wonderful. And I'm pretty sure that so many people who are here, they also agree.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. And perhaps if you have any questions, you could leave them in the chat box. And in the meantime, Gianluca, I believe you have a question for Mona.
Thank you very much, Rula, and thank you very much, Mona, for your absolutely wonderful session. Really touching, really wonderful. Absolutely, it was a real privilege for me to be here today. And I would like to ask you a question about the impact that your past legal profession had on your current career in poetry, because you mentioned the differences between the legal language, which is very strict, very narrow and limited, and the poetry language. But I would like you, to explain us a bit more about the impact that your past legal profession is having on your poetry today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's such a good question, and one that I answer differently according to how I'm feeling about things. And actually, when I first started writing poetry, I think I answered the question very differently. And now, looking back, and I've been writing poetry seriously now for about 12 years. I would say that the answer is quite sort of difficult to explain, but I guess one of the things that it's given me is because I worked as a human rights lawyer, and I was doing, some of the most difficult cases, dealing with, families of often bereaved people, and it was really difficult work. I mean, I absolutely love the work, and it was an honor to be doing that work. But I think that there is something about the dignity of the human. I think that value, that is so, I think, important in poetry. That is also obviously a part of what I was doing when I was a lawyer. And I think that those essential things, what makes us human, compassion, empathy, or empathy is such an overused word, but I think that it's an important word, because for empathy, you need the imagination. You need really, it's when you talk about empathy, we're talking about that leap that we make to put ourselves in somebody else's shoes. That's the jump that we make. And I think that the writing poetry is so actually intrinsically bound with the imagination, and thereby empathy, but I use imagination before I use the word empathy. That I think that those two things are really important. And I think so I can sort of draw a line between like the work and that I was doing and the work I feel like I'm still doing in language. And so I think that is probably the answer on a kind of more, abstract level, that's the answer. But I also think that I feel like I'm very good at editing myself, because I feel I'm very good at sort of looking at text and sort of, and so I'm good at that. I think I'm quite good at sort of being quite cold with poems. And I think that that's something that you have to learn to do when you're a poet. You actually have to make the poem and then look at it once you've finished it and captured it and all the work's been done on it, and then really consider the poem in a cold way. And I think I'm quite good at that because of the training as a lawyer.
Thank you very much for your very illuminating words. Absolutely. I think we have a lot of questions in the chat box, Roula.
Well, I hope I can answer them.
Roula, I think you are muted.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. Thank you, Gianluca.
No worries.
Right. We have a question from Sheila McHugh. And Sheila asks Mona, can you say a little bit more about the ghazal form of poetry, please?
The ghazal. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So yes. So it's a really, really interesting form. I mean, I'll show you how the poem looks. A ghazal looks on the page, and you'll see it's in couplets. These are two ghazals back to back. And you can see that they're in couplets. So that's one of the defining features of a ghazal. So the ghazal actually originated in Persia in the 13th century. It's older than the sonnet. And it's the kind of driving force and energy of many, many people in the world. It's an important, as important or more important than the sonnet. And so the couplet is very interesting, and so what's important about the ghazal and what's so different about, say, for example, as the sonnet, is that the couplet is the unit that you use in a ghazal, and the couplet itself can almost be a poem in itself. And so there's this kind of no particular relationship between the couplets in a poem, but what unifies the ghazal itself is the music and a refrain, which you would have heard in one of the ghazals, which was notice. So you keep hearing that refrain. And I think it's really important to understand that with a ghazal, I think that it's not so much written as composed, because it's so much in the ear, so ear-led. And I feel like when I teach the form to people, that's what I say. I said when you write it here, and then write it down. So yeah, and there are lots of other features about the ghazal as well. The other feature is the fact that it has typically some internal rhyme just before the refrain I mentioned, and it has something called like the galus at the end, or couplet, which is like the signature, which is what the poet traditionally used to do. They used to sign off the ghazal with their name. I don't do that because I feel a bit self-conscious, because I feel like I have one foot in the English tradition of writing and then one foot in the kind of more Eastern tradition. So all my kind of, sensibilities of like not putting myself in the poem come out when I'm writing.
Thank you, Mona.
Long reply.
Would anybody like to use the microphone and speak to Mona directly? I'm looking for hands. Sheila says, thank you. So interesting. I don't see any hands yet. Okay, I'll read some of the comments. Lani says, thank you, Mona, very moving. Amy says, gorgeous ghazal. Thanks, Mona. Alan says, gorgeous poems. Sheila says, love is so present in that poem. Thank you, Mona. And Denise says, 5-year update, such a powerful reading. Gur says, such a moving poem. Beautiful, amazing. I said, room is choked with living things. Wow, I really love that part. Amy says, lion and I break bread. Fabulous, wonderful reading. Yes, so it has been wonderful indeed. Mona, how did you, I'm not asking about the therapeutic aspect of poetry as in, therapy-wise, but how did writing poems about the tragedy in your family, how did it help you articulate your grief? Was it soothing in a way, or what was the effect?
I think that I don't think it was consoling or soothing, really. I think it was just I had to do it, and because I was a poet, and actually I thought that was I felt very strongly that I knew enough about poetry and poetry's role and poetry's legacy and how it's been knee deep in this kind of work, elegy work, that I felt like there was a real I felt like a responsibility to attend to the death of a younger sibling that had died. I really, really felt that very, very strongly, and I didn't know whether or not I could do it, actually. And a lot of the poems that are in the books are saying, I just don't know if I can do this. Is it possible for me to do it? I kind of had an argument with poetry for a little while, is it going to help? How am I going to do it? And is it possible? And even if it is possible, so what? But I realized that it didn't really matter. All those things didn't matter. I felt I had to have this, I had to attend to it somehow in language. And surely that's what I do now. It's like I was a human rights lawyer, but now this is what I do. So I've got to try and do this. And I did feel like I wanted to dignify that life in some ways. And so, yeah, I guess, and transforming something that is so awful into something that, often people talk about poems being beautiful, was something that I had to also sort of tussle with, beauty from something that's so awful. you know, and because often beauty is a byproduct of something that we're writing into that's very painful, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something I wasn't really expecting, you know, that there's beautiful things to be said of occupying that terrain and writing from it as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So it's more of a gift in honor of, or in celebration of your brother's life.
Partly, and partly just a sort of, I'm having to do this because this is what my job is now. That's what poets do, you know.
Wow, that's very powerful. I mean, feeling the responsibility of, you know, letting this go through you and then out so that you could give it into the world is just wonderful.
Yeah, and I do think that when I meet people or I read poems, you know, in the days that we could go to festivals and read, you know, and meet people in real life, I felt that it, you know, it matters to people to have themselves reflected, you know, in poetry.
Right.
And I think that has always been an important function of poetry. I feel like this, you know, personal experience, it's not a particular thing. You've gone from the particular to the universal, you know. That felt like it feels like important to me.
And it is, of course it is, because you touch so many people with your poems, and perhaps especially people who have gone through similar experiences as well.
I mean, Jane Hirschfield, who I love, I mean, she always says, you know, the purpose of lyric poetry is to make, you know, you feel less lonely in the world where everything is happening to everyone at this, you know, at different times. We're all going to lose someone, we're all going, you know, so it's the purpose is to sort of to make you feel like you're less alone in those experiences, which I kind of abide by, really.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Mona. Susan is asking if you can read from Somebody Loves You. Yes, Mona is planning to read that in the second half of the session. So before we take a screen break, there's just one more question that we will take by Raymond Harrison. Raymond asks, what poets do you read for inspiration?
Oh, gosh. Again, that changes week to week. I read a lot. There are certain go-to poets for me that I feel are like my touchstone poets. And one of those is Mimi Khalvati. I think that she's also been my teacher and my mentor, and she's just, to me, just most illuminating lyric poet. And she also has taught me about form and, you know, all sorts of other things. So, but otherwise, Louise Gluck. I mean, I love Louise Gluck because I love the way that, I guess, I love the way that actually with her poetry, there's this idea of, she's so against the explicit, you know, because it's, everything is in the inference, everything is in the kind of implicit, which I kind of really like, because I think that in the world we live in, so much is explicit, so much is on the nose, and poetry doesn't do that. That's the poetry I like to read. I prefer the poetry where you have to participate, you have to meet language halfway. You have to, a poem is not a passive inert thing on the page. You actually have to do some of that work. And that is really important. And again, it's the work of the imagination and the work of empathy. It's that leap that you take. And I think that summoning as opposed to imposing thought is why I love poetry like that.
That's a very beautiful way of putting it. Thank you, Mona. We do have some more questions. We will take them after the break and during the next Q&A. So we're going to have a 2-minute screen break before we start the next part of the session. So we'll see you in 2. All right.
Thank you. Thank you for that little break. I just had a little water break. So yeah, I guess I'll start to talk about the novel, and I should explain how I got to writing this novel. Because to be honest with you, it surprised me that I've written this novel as well. So I kind of feel like I wrote this novel completely by accident. I fell into writing this novel. I know it doesn't sound convincing, but honestly, I had written 2 books, Dear Big Gods and Small Hands, which came very quickly. And then I had this period of like not writing anything, because I'd written quite a lot of poems quite quickly together. And then I just didn't know what to do, because I just felt, it didn't feel like, I didn't want to call it writer's block, because as soon as you call it writer's block, it becomes a thing. But I did feel as if I just needed to continue exercising this writing muscle, because that felt important, because I was a writer. So, that's what I should do. So I thought I would just write something. And there was a voice in my head, and that voice was Ruby. And she was, I didn't know what it was. All I did was commit myself to writing it every day. I'd sort of attend to it and write a little bit of it. Initially, I thought it might be like a little narrative kind of little sequence or something, but it was very, very clear that the lines got longer. It had character, there was a sister came along. And I realized that actually about 5,000 words in, I wasn't in a poem anymore. I was in some other domain in another room in the house, which was the room of the room of prose. And there's a really amazing quote by Anne Parsons that many poets know. If prose is a house, poetry is a man on fire running quite fast through it. It's a great quote. But I feel that with my poems, I feel like they're really difficult to get to. I feel like if we had a house, they would be like in the attic, and you would need the fire escape ladder to get to them. They're just really unwieldy, and you have to literally extract them. But I feel very differently about the prose. With the prose, I feel they're downstairs. Prose is downstairs in the living room on the sofa, just like, living it up downstairs. And it's quite easy, not easy, but I feel like I can access prose quite easily. And I think that's the difference. I mean, I think that with the novel, I could sort of literally sit down at my desk and sort of continue writing it. And obviously with poems, that can never happen. There's a kind of conjuring that has to happen. You have to really have the right conditions, I do anyway, to make poems. So yeah, this book kind of came into the world because of the voice. And I suppose what the book is about is, again, it's really a book about that's interested in language. It's an inquiry into silence. The narrator, Ruby, never talks. And it's about language under pressure, really. So I'll read a little bit of the novel. I start with the first page. I should also explain that Ruby is a character who's about 17, 18 years old. And in a way, the whole kind of novel is trying to navigate those small veins of sort of girlhood, that really interesting time when you're sort of, leaving your childhood and you're going into adulthood, and you're quite oozy and open. I think it's just a wonderful sort of time to write about. And Ruby also has a mentally ill mother, and who is sometimes absent, sometimes present. She's certainly not functioning very well. So that's the context of the book. Foxes. The day my sister tried to drag the baby fox into our house was the same day my mother had her first mental breakdown. In many ways, it was a perfect morning for a breakdown. The rain was spitting softly. The Parker's dog just wouldn't stop barking. It went on, emitting that terrible noise, like it was a machine loaded with everlasting batteries. In the living room, I had just finished watching a long documentary about wild kangaroos. Upstairs, there was a doctor, the aunties, and my father, of course. There was a toy, a miniature replica camera that my sister was jealous of, and she kept prizing the camera for my fingers and pointing it at things she liked the look of and saying, "See, I can click, till eventually I had to steal it away from her and hang the long leather strap around my neck. For days we'd known about the foxes. They'd come closer and closer to the house and had been chewing at the garden boots my mum had stored under the corrugated plastic shelter. I went into the kitchen and the side door was open. And there was Rania, crouching on the steps, carrying a bundle, a blanket covering the body, so that only its ears and eyes were visible. I heard the front door click open, then slam shut. The fox yelped and slipped away, and we didn't see my mother again for 3 whole months. So that's the beginning of her story. And I guess the other thing to say about this book is that I suppose the way the form is structured is quite unusual. So there is a story, there is a sort of beginning, middle, and end, but inside that kind of trajectory, there are poems that I would say are prose poems that I sort of dropped in, like airdropped in almost into the world of the narration. And that's because a lot of the book is around her trauma, Ruby's trauma. And I really felt that the only way of being able to be truthfully tell her story about her trauma was to not really to have a sort of more circular book, to have this kind of constant ebb and flow of her memories, because actually our memories are fluid and they come in and out and wash over us, all the time. They're not just there, the whole point is they come in and out, and particularly trauma memories, we kind of trip over them the whole time. And so I felt that was the most honest way of being able to tell the story of Ruby. So I'll read a tiny little prose poem, I suppose you could call it. It's called Agony. So it's just like, literally 12 lines airdropped into the book. When I first heard the word agony from the mouth of my mother, I was halfway up the stairs, and it had escaped from underneath my parents' bedroom door. It was as if some unknown force had passed me on the staircase. I felt winded and had to quickly grab hold of the banister to steady myself. Of all the A words, agony is the worst. I wouldn't wish that word on my greatest enemy. I wasn't even that sure what the word meant, but it was clear to me there was a sliver of glass in the middle of the brittle O. Agony was the point of no return. No greater anguish could befall you when you reached it, and there was no coming back from the edge of its abyss, which was another A word. And I'll read you a little sort of like a slightly longer section here. And I'm sort of reading, it's because the book is quite lyrical. It's obviously written by a poet, and so I'm interested in language. I'm interested in how the sonic kind of sound of the sentence. And so this section is where Ruby is in the bedroom, and she's thinking back to something that's to do with a doll that she had. And it tells you a lot about her mind and how her mind works, and how her kind of almost obsession with texture of language. In my bedroom, there were still all the familiar things that make up a girl's room. But I no longer wanted furry bears holding hearts that were sewn onto their fur paws, or even the pale cotton bed covers washed into softness. Everything looked wrong, like it was some other girl's room. I used to have a medium-sized doll. I'd named her Pinky because of her light pink jumpsuit and fuchsia hairband and socks. I played with her and loved her until one day from the shelf, she winked and scared me. I put her in a box. I coffined her up in a box and slid her underneath the bed so I didn't have to look at her. All was fine for a few days until something woke me up from my sleep. A small powder-touch hand lightly pressed my forehead, testing my body temperature. I knelt down and retrieved the box, but the doll, clever as she was, had popped herself back, lightning quick. I decided to conduct a little blessing over the box. I crafted a curse prayer and uttered the words softly, but with conviction into the cold air of the room. Some things need to be uttered. All curses, certain prayers, a whisper will do. At this small funeral, what did I say? a concoction of words from the garden, something like a potion with magical and dark intent. All the grass names I knew at the time, the yew tree, the dying elms, those bad sounding words beginning with V, venal, varicose, virgin. I added the word vulva because it went nicely with vetch. Strong, earthly words which accreted dark power. And when it was all done, I suddenly understood that I hadn't done it right. Any love thing needs a funeral. All that energy has to go somewhere after all. Things that I loved need attending to in death. So I gave my doll Pinky a kiss on the lips. I said goodbye. I gave her dues and her funeral rites, and she never disturbed me again. So I'll stop there, I think, and maybe take questions if that's okay. It's not a big, it's not a very long book, so.
Thank you so much, Mona. I still haven't read it yet, but I can't wait to do so. Thank you for sharing some little glimpses that made me even more excited to just get that book and start reading. Right, we had a question when we stopped. Paula, your hand was up. So maybe you would like to start with your question. Are you still here, Paula? Can't see Paula anymore. All right, so I'll go to the chat box. We had a question in the chat box too. The question is by Elvire. Elvire asks, how did you make the transition from being a lawyer who places the focus on the client and keeps themselves out of it to being a poet where your inner world is part of the content and inspiration?
It's a good question. Another good question. I mean, personally, I try to keep myself out of my poems as much as I can. I mean, I feel embarrassed to be in my poems. I feel like I'm not in my poems as much as the experience or the actual energy of the experience, I suppose, of the feeling is in my poems. But I feel like I feel like once I've done a poem, actually, once I've written it, I check to see that there's no sign of me, too much of a sign of me in the poem. But of course, we are writing our poems. We are bodies, we're humans, we're, you know, not machines. And so there are parts of us, there's sort of like a little echo. We almost leave our echo of ourselves in the work. But I feel like I guess it's just how much of us we leave, you know, how much of it we leave in the poetry. I would feel like I feel very reticent about it. I feel like I really wouldn't want to leave too much of myself in a poem. It feels important to me. I don't write confessional poetry. I feel like my poems are sort of more transformed of the experience, even though they are difficult experiences.
Right, that is very interesting. So the I, if you ever use the I pronoun in your poems, it's not the literal you. It's not Mona. It's an exploration of maybe somebody else or another experience or a different voice that could be within, not you.
I mean, absolutely. I mean, I feel as if we can dramatize the I, you know, which is something I'm really interested in. I mean, it's really interesting because I think that women in particular, women writing poetry, lyric poetry, are often elided with that I. But I think what we are also doing is transformation. And, you know, I think that it's important to remember that we're using something and well, what are we doing as poets? We're translating the world into language, you know, and so we are, although we are writing in the lyric mode and we're using the I, that doesn't mean, I think it's, doesn't mean that we are literally the I, you know. I don't think I am that interesting and my life is that interesting that I would want to write poems about myself and just be the I. But I feel like the journey of the language of the poem and discovering something about something else, illuminating something by using the I is what I'm sort of interested in.
That's fascinating. And it actually connects to what we were speaking about in yesterday's session when we spoke about the Jungian poetics and our collective unconscious, the archetypes, which are the many different roles, the many different energies that we have inside. that are not necessarily us, but they are not us. So that's why, you could write 10 poems, each poem with a different voice, none of them about you as who you are or as who you present yourself to be. So it's really a fascinating exploration through the eye.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the most interesting thing, actually, because we could be 10 of us in a room and experience something. We could all be quite similar. We could be 10 women, and yet we would be able to transform that into something, into language and a poetic line in a very different way. Some of us might use the surreal because we want to be distance from it, which sometimes I think is useful. Some of us would be wanting to have much more of an interface with the experience, so I feel like we should just be able to do that, and that distance and that closeness is something that is a judgment call you make in poems, and the language often does that work for you because it does it, and you just follow the language of follow the head of the poem, what the poem is trying to tell you to do, which I think is often the answer, to be honest with you. It's often the answer. The poem is always wiser, or the poem is always wiser. The poem itself is always
that.
It's always, because we get in the way often of our work. And I think once we get ourselves out of the way, the poem is revealed.
Gottfried, Dr. Gottfried Hoyer, who is a Jungian analyst, would like to ask a question.
Oh, okay, I'm a bit worried now, but okay. Hi.
Hi.
Yeah, now you're unmuted.
I was just wondering whether you could possibly say a little bit more about what you were just talking about in terms of trying hard to keep yourself out of the poem, which seems, I mean, it's a question. It's not a criticism, but it feels in some sense so much the opposite of what you mentioned in passing earlier on, that some of the Persian poets, and I mean, I know it myself from Hafiz and Rumi, they actually put their names into their poems. So it's very much their personal presence that continues to be there, in a way, I can say, over the centuries. But I say it's not a criticism, but I'm just interested in the difference between what comes over from some of those poets at times, and you're just saying, I try to keep myself out of it.
Yes, yeah, and I totally agree with you. I mean, Agha Shahid Ali, I don't know if you read his work, but he's a really important poet for poets that write ghazals, and he wrote a really important essay about how to write a ghazal in English. So he helped transport the form, the traditional, the canonical form into English. And he's very interesting because I think that when you read his poems in English, I feel as if the heart is exposed very much, like the business of the poem almost, that is so different to like a Western kind of poem where the heart is, it feels as if there's a different way of approaching that. But I agree with you, it feels as if there's a very, very different exposure that's happening in that work. For me, I come from a sort of, I mean, I've got my sort of one foot in one tradition and one foot in the other, so I have this constantly, to be honest, we have this little tussle about how much I do expose and how much I don't. But I think essentially because of me, because of how my personality and also just the way I write, and I like to be a bit coded, it's just a real preference I have for my way of writing, to always sort of have something that's slightly left out, that I try to leave out. And so when I'm in my poems and I'm editing, I try to do that. I try to sort of cut out. But I think that's just a personal, very personal thing I have. And I think it is to do with the fact that I understand what's possible, because I understand the ghazal mode, and I understand the aesthetics of the ghazal. I've read enough ghazals now in Urdu, heard enough in Urdu and seen enough in English to understand what's happening. And I appreciate it so much. But I feel as if even in my ghazals, I am very coded. I don't know. It's a very interesting discussion, a really good question. And I think that it asks us to talk, to sort of think about how the aesthetics is very different often in Western poetry, where you don't mention the heart, and which I sort of feel very much, I'm part of that tradition too,
Yeah.
So it's that kind of constant tussle, I think, that is interesting actually to me.
Could I possibly just add, maybe it's a too simplistic observation, but the poet whom you just mentioned, I think, is male, and
yes,
Rumi and Hafiz are male as well. Is there possibly a link to gender differences, or is that?
I think it was just because women were just really not, they just didn't have access. And
of course,
but
yeah.
there are many I certainly know English poets that are female that are writing ghazals, like Marilyn Hacker, Mimi Kalvati. So it's not, it is something, it's a form that many people are using, many women are using.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And it's absolutely wonderful what you have read.
Oh, thank you
so much.
Thanks for the question.
Thank you, Gottfried and Mona. Mona, Glenda is asking to spell the name of the ghazal poet that you mentioned.
Yes. Shall I write it in? Can I write it somewhere?
Yeah.
Can I write it in the chat?
Just in the chat box.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to do that right now. So I would definitely recommend this poet. There you go. He unfortunately died, I think, about 10 years ago. But there's a really important essay that he published in a book called Ravishing Disunities. And it's about 10 pages long. And it's just a really interesting discussion around why the ghazal matters, and how the challenges of writing the ghazal in English that he's come across, because he taught the ghazal, of course, in English to the American poets and the US poets. And actually it's very interesting, because when you read US magazines, the ghazal is very embedded in their culture. You can see it because they've been taught it very, very well. You pick up poetry magazine and you often see a ghazal that's a very well-made ghazal. So yeah, he's an important, I think if you're going to starting to think about the language of the ghazal and what it means, I think that's probably a good place to start.
Thank you for the suggestion, Mona. Any other questions? Anyone would like to take the plunge and use the mic? Okay, Amy says, thank you, Mona. Guess the questions are still being cooked up. Gianluca, you had another question, right? Oh, sorry, Clive and Glenda. Hi, Clive.
Hi. You say you want to keep yourself out of the poems. But do you see your poems as more of a reflection? I think it was Marex Ford said about you wanted to capture the reflection as you pass in water in a car window. So it's a reflection of the experience.
Yes, I guess that's probably what is, I don't write the poem thinking, oh, I'm going to write a poem and make sure I'm completely out of this poem. I feel as if I go to a poem, I encounter what I'm going to be writing, and I try to attend to it in the language that that feels right and natural, and the metaphors that land, naturally into the the thing I'm attending to, you know, even if it's a leaf or something. You know, I recently did a nature project, and I was writing about birds, so I was having to, you know, encounter this whole landscape that I didn't know, that felt very foreign to me. So how would I do that? You know, so it's a question of just, a lot of what we do as poets is just observation, you know, just a kind of like a kind of like curiosity about looking, you know, and tending to, and trying to translate that into something, you know, that's fresh and something that actually activates something in the reader that perhaps they haven't seen before, I think, you know, which is why, you know, how do you write about a tree? You know, when everyone, you know, for centuries have written about trees. How do you write into that? So I guess it's just I sort of think it depends on what you're trying to do and what you're attending to as well. I mean, I was attending to a very difficult grief. I really think I felt like very unfairly having to attend to that at a very early stage of my poetic, you know, writing career. I really don't want to do that again, but it taught me quite a lot about how to listen to those things that are arising, and observing and attending to those small little things that we often don't see, you know, that are in the periphery. I think that's what our kind of job is, you know, to see and listen to the things that maybe other people don't even think that they're there, you know. Yeah, so that's my kind of airy-fairy answer to your question.
Right.
Thank you, Mona. Gianluca, who has the other question?
Yeah, I think Glenda raised her hand. I saw, yeah.
Okay, I was very interested that you did a lot of civil liberties work, and you sounds like you were a bit of an activist.
Yeah.
And the impression I've gotten now is that you only started you sort of ended that career and started poetry. So I'm wondering, were you writing poetry at all, or reading poetry during your, you know, very busy litigation days?
Oh, yeah.
And, do you feel that that kind of background has affected how you write and what you write, or was there an abrupt shift?
Again, a really good question. I don't know the answer to that question, but I can tell you that poetry has always been part of my life. I've read it. I haven't necessarily written it, but it's been part and parcel. It was really important for me in my 20s. And then when I was in this very difficult work, you know, I was reading to feel like I was, you know, suddenly visible, you know. I think it visibilizes you in your kind of struggles sometimes when you're right. And I guess it just made me more attentive. But I never thought I was going to write poetry until I got pregnant with my daughters, and I had a period of 2 months in bed, to be honest with you, and somebody sent me some poems in the post, and it was contemporary poetry, and literally I was just fixated by the work. I just couldn't believe it was legal this poetry was legal. My God, you know, why isn't everybody reading this stuff? And, I also feel that there was another overlaying thing, which was I was pregnant with twins. So all these things were happening to my body. And I think there was a combination of that and then meeting poetry that I hadn't seen for a long time, particularly women's poetry, you know, and thinking, my goodness, you know, you can write a poem about anything. Poetry can hold anything, you know. I mean, it was incredible. So I think there was a kind of combination of things at the same time, a confluence of factors.
Do you still have a desire to improve the world, to change the world? Or is that something which is sort of, is that part of poetry as well? Or is that something you've also moved out of in a way?
Well, I mean, I think that I really think poetry is important. I mean, it depends what you think about language. You know, do we care about language? Do we care about empathy? Do we care about, you know, making sure that we are writing about things that nobody else really wants to write about? Are we making sure that we're resisting the banal and the reductive. Are we complicating? Are we being, things like subtlety? All those things, I think are really important. And they're important for us because they're important parts of like going to all four corners of your imagination. And so if we don't do those things, I mean, language allows us to do that. And in particular, poetry allows us to be mobile in language and to think about, going to things that other areas, other genres don't let you do. I don't think. So I think poetry is important, and I think we have to center it and we have to use it, and we need our poets to be able to do this work. And actually, when you look historically at, poets, I mean, we are where we are at the moment in our world, but if we look at, the Eastern European poets and what they were writing, they were doing that work. Poets have always done that work. They've done that heavy lifting where other people haven't done that work, often to their cost. But so I think language is important. I think poets are important, but I feel like I'm a new age convert. So I feel like because I came to it later, I've become like the kind of like the person that won't shut up about how poetry is important. I'm one of those, I'm afraid.
Thank you.
So it was kind of vocational for you in a way, Mona.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it's some way of looking at it. I've sort of treated it like that a little bit. I didn't know how else to treat it, to be honest with you. That's how I kind of roll, so I think reading widely was the greatest gift, just to be able to gift, when I was pregnant, and just being able to just open this door to this library where poets were just, in translation, and just reading avant-garde poets, and not necessarily wanting to write like that, but appreciating them, and narrative poetry, and the ghazal, and encountering these forms. So and yeah, it was a gift, really, a gift,
And a lovely one indeed. And Gianluca, I see your hand is up.
Yeah, thank you very much, Rula. And I have an additional question for Mona, if I can.
Yes.
Do you think that an interdisciplinary background can be useful for anyone who would like to start studying poetry and maybe writing it one day?
So I think that I don't think it should preclude you from writing. I actually think that having a life before writing is really good, to be honest with you. I think that I don't think I would have had anything to say really otherwise. I felt like I would have had, I mean, I don't know, I don't think I would have had anything to say for me if I hadn't sort of done the work I mean, I didn't know that, of course. It's only when you look back and you think about, your experiences make you, and they transform you, your psyche, and they obviously gets into the texture of the work. So I think that it shouldn't preclude you. And I think that, maybe if I'd been a lawyer, a different type of lawyer, I don't know, I mean, I wonder whether or not being a human rights lawyer and being right in the thick of it in terms of what was, really difficult work of empathy anyway, I think, but in a very different way. I mean, I think poetry is for everyone, and I think we shouldn't be, boxing it up. I think we should just be giving it on the NHS. Should be giving prescriptions of poetry to the NHS. I can't, even people that say they don't like poetry, often I think haven't read the poems that they can fall in love with. They haven't yet met the language yet, because every time you hear somebody saying that, and you find the poem for them, or a poet, that they will always find something. You can always find something that you'll love.
Mm-hmm. You've heard of the poetry pharmacy, right, Mona?
Yeah, that's William Sieghart, I think, runs something like the pharmacy.
Yeah, and now there's the emerging poetry therapy as well.
Yeah, oh yeah, that's true. So, these are good ideas, and, getting kids young into poetry, I think, is really important, and all sorts of poetry. I'd love the idea of everybody on a Friday, you know, everyone over the age of 11, just been, we have the technology to do this. Why can't they all just be sent the same poem? And then you go home and you discuss that poem with your parents, and just everyone has a discussion about the same poem. How amazing would that be? You know, just to, anyway, I'm going off on a, we need a ministry of poetry.
You never know.
You never know.
Well, I believe we still have time for one more question before the time is up. So is there anyone who would like to pitch in before we close? Right, I'm flipping through the 2 pages. And right, if anyone wrote something on the chat box and I missed it, then please just feel free to go ahead and speak. Yes, Gottfried, yes.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I just very, very much like the idea of, I mean, as an analyst, as a therapist myself, I very much like the idea of poetry therapy. I sometimes occasionally do send poems to the people I work with. And I'm not even sure whether it's true, but I think a couple of years ago, I also read that some people in New York do kind of art therapy, in the sense of prescribing to be with a certain painting for half an hour or so to people who they seem to be in need of what this particular painting expresses. And to do the same with poetry feels absolutely, absolutely wonderful. And thank you so much again. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Oh, thank you all for being here. Mona, thank you for this brilliant session. We loved your poetry. We loved your prose.
Having me.
I can't wait until I read Somebody Loves You. And yeah, you made us think of so many things. And, you know, lots of the verses that you've read are kind of going to linger for a while. Really, it was a great honor. It was a wonderful, wonderful time. And we want to thank you for taking a bit of your busy schedule and giving it to Indelible and to this lovely group of poetry aficionados and poets that are here with us today. And thanks for sharing your experiences.
Thank you.
And
Thanks.
Gianluca, thank you so much too for being such a wonderful host.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Rula and Mona. It was a wonderful session. Absolutely. It was a real honor and privilege to be here. So thank you very much and congratulations again, really.
Thank you.
Right, so Mona, we are hoping to see you again at some point at other events as well, and hopefully in person too. So when Indelible is able to carry on its activities in London or somewhere. Well, thank you so much. Thank you, and have a wonderful evening, everybody, or morning. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.